Katherine Johnson.
Katherine Johnson.
Katherine Johnson.
Katherine Johnson.
Broke their barriers in the segregated South, working as a human computer for NASA.
Katherine calculated the flight path for America's first mission in space.
She understood the mathematics at a very, very high level. People depended on her calculations in order to make sure that the flight would be successful.
On May 5, 1961, Katherine Johnson, one of NASA's first African-American women aerospace engineers, saw her trajectory calculations take flight with Freedom 7. This was NASA's first human-bearing space capsule, and the mission proved to be a stepping stone for all future space missions. Her effort and the space launch forever marked a turning point in space engineering, and knocked down racial and gender barriers, challenging social norms and proving the incredible abilities of women and African Americans. The scene is the early 1950s. Many say it was the birth of the American dream, as new cars and homes were becoming more accessible for the average American. Tensions between the US and Soviet Union were beginning to heat up in the midst of the Cold War, and a competition soon known as the space race was brewing. When it came to American daily life, it was portrayed as being good and fair. However, the real truth was quite the opposite. During this time period, Black Americans were left out of this American dream. Blacks were rarely given equal respect or opportunities as whites and were segregated into purposefully low-funded schools as racial violence plagued the country. Women also faced many barriers in this time, as education was much harder for them to acquire in comparison to men, with many colleges restricting or banning their admission entirely as society pushed homemaker gender roles. Despite all of this, there was a woman living in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia right now, about to knock down all of the barriers America put in her way. She was Katherine Johnson.
She said she used to count the plates and the silverware, and so she always loved numbers.
Growing up, Katherine had always loved mathematics and excelled in academics. She spent her time counting the stars that covered the sky above her or solving whatever complex problem lay in front of her. She attended high school at just 10 and became one of the first 3 Black students to integrate the graduate school at West Virginia University. It was when attending college that she found math was the true path she wanted to take for her career. And after hearing that NASA needed more mathematicians, the United States Langley NASA Research Center would be where she set off for.
When she went to college, the professor had her and everything he taught her, she was just maxing. And he said, I think you'd make a good math researcher. And she said, well, what's that? He said, well, that's for you to find out.
Joining NASA in 1953, Katherine began as a research mathematician, one of the few jobs where women and Blacks worked in the still segregated NASA. Yet it was a very unfair playing field. Katherine realized white women didn't need a college degree to get a job, yet she was expected to have a college degree in math with honors. Still, white women at NASA felt Black women didn't belong in such a workplace. She didn't let the unfair standards get to her and kept working hard. Soon, she was moved to do computations for higher departments. Yet walking into the new, completely white male office, the first word she was met with from the head director was the condescending statement, "Don't come in here in 2 weeks asking for a transfer." Her white male co-workers made her feel like she didn't belong. The lunchroom had a colored section, and the segregated bathroom sat as a demeaning reminder of racism, as she wrote in her memoir. Despite being put in a group to lead forward humanity's space capabilities, she was still not seen as an equal. Even with this treatment, she focused on her work and persevered. She stood proud in who she was.
I just happened to be working with guys, and when they had briefings on it, I asked permission to go. And they said, well, the girls don't usually go. And I said, well, is there a law? And I began attending the briefings, and gradually I did more.
After a while, the men realized they needed and relied on her computations, and although she faced opposition from some, her always correct calculations became well respected. She began to specialize in trajectory analysis for aircrafts, as one of the only women and blacks holding an engineering title at the time, figuring out where rockets have to start to hit the wanted target and end where needed. In her department, everything she did held core importance, and any small miscalculation could completely threaten the balance of the entire mission. However, in 1960, rather than one normal mission, she was given the trajectory for a mission that proved to be a stepping stone for all future space missions. This was Freedom 7. It was the first space capsule NASA had made that was sending a person into space. JFK had tried for America to send a person to the moon, and Freedom 7 was one of the main instrumental steps. However, an extremely essential part of the mission, the trajectory of the rocket, was still an uncracked code, and the men and others in her department couldn't seem to find the answer, with each of their calculations ending in a failure. As soon as she saw the trajectory, it clicked for her, explaining that the early Project Freedom 7 trajectory was a parabola, and it was easy to predict where it would be at any point. When they said they wanted Shepard's capsule to come down at a certain place, they were trying to compute when it should start. I said, let me do it. You tell me where you want it and where you want to land, and I'll do it backwards and tell you where to take off. And that's exactly what she did. Soon enough, the uncracked code was on Katherine's paper, and the so-called easy answers in her mind. She had found the solution. And as she sat in anticipation on the morning of May 5th, 1961, watching the Freedom 7 rocket launch and soar higher and higher into space, and the eventual mission successful call, she knew everything had been worth it. After this instrumental breakthrough in space science, Katherine Johnson continued to mark her name through the history book. Just 8 years after the Freedom 7 mission success, her trajectory analysis skills and calculations were used to launch the Apollo 11 moon landing mission, one of the most incredible feats of human space science, and a step forward so great that she was yet again at the forefront of innovation. Remarkably, nearly every mission since the 1961 Freedom 7 flight has been built thanks to a base of Katherine Johnson's calculations. Dozens of space shuttles like the Mercury Atlas 4 through 9, Gemini 3 through 12, Apollo 7 through 17, Skylab 2, 3, and 4, and dozens after those all branch off of the very calculations Katherine Johnson wrote down back in the 1961 Freedom 7 mission.
The story of Katherine Johnson and the other mathematicians that worked with her definitely had an impact on my career. It's people like her and others that came along with her that paved the way for people like me to become astronauts.
She proved in a very silent way that coming to work every day and doing her best and contributing, continuing to learn. And because of that, so many people like me are now standing on her shoulders.
Katherine Johnson paved a way for women and Black Americans. Her abilities helped build the NASA minority workforce from close to none in 1950s America to 35% women and 30% minorities today. She set a trend for Black women, as they now hold critical roles in the organization, from astronauts to engineers, and helped turn the tides at NASA. Her efforts have branched out into the NASA we see today, with diversity and inclusion plans, equity and inclusion as a core value, and many programs like the Science, Engineering, Mathematics, and Aerospace Academies across the organization set up to help get more women and girls into STEM as well as NASA. All of this has happened from a ripple effect of Katherine Johnson and her extraordinary skills helping to pave a way from the start. Katherine Johnson and her work with Freedom 7 marked a turning point in space science and equality at NASA. Freedom 7's importance was so crucial, marking it the first time the US had ever put a person in space. It taught us what we had to do and how to safely get a person in and out of space. Katherine Johnson's calculations from Freedom 7 to Apollo 11's mission to the moon sit as a building block for nearly all NASA missions. Her trailblazing capabilities paved the way for countless women and Black Americans who now work at NASA. And at a time where the country had significant racial and gender barriers, Katherine Johnson took a seat at NASA and changed the world of space science forever.